So for those of you who I've not met before, my name is Emma King. I'm the CEO of the Victorian Council of Social Service, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this morning. It's fantastic to be here again for the VCOSS 2022 post-budget breakfast with the Treasurer. And welcome, Treasurer. It's wonderful to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to a fantastic morning today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and to emerging leaders, and of course acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge Aunty Jill Gallagher, who is in the room. Jill, who is the CEO of VACCHO, Victoria's first Treaty Commissioner and a VCOSS board member, which we're particularly excited about, so it's wonderful to have you here. And also Meena Singh, the Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. There's some other people in the room that I would also like to acknowledge. So Todd Fernando, Victoria's Commissioner for LGBTIQ+ communities, Jared Mansour, the Commissioner for Senior Victorians, and Craig Robertson, the CEO for the Victorian Skills Association, and Lisa Lyne, who is the Chair of the Victorian Skills Authority. I should know it, I'm on it. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. It's clearly an early morning after budget. And of course, a thank you to our members and our friends who are in the room for what is a really fantastic occasion every day, and it's such a wonderful thing to be able to have the opportunity to ask the Treasurer questions directly around the budget and to have this moment to be together. And I think it's particularly special given the COVID environment that we've been in, and the chance to gather together is particularly important. So I really want to acknowledge that and look forward to catching up with those of you that I haven't had a chance to chat to yet. I'm now going to introduce you to our wonderful event MC for today, who will really get us started. Sharnelle Vella, I think, needs no introduction. She is known to everyone as Channel 7's Victorian political reporter. She's a podcaster, a celebrated dog lover, and an incredible woman on Twitter. She's also, most importantly, a sharp and incisive questioner. And those of us who have the privilege of watching, perverse privilege maybe, of watching hundreds of press conferences throughout the COVID lockdowns know too well how brilliant she is at her job. So we're very lucky to have Sharnelle with us this morning, and I will pass over to her now. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I was meant to say who I am, but that was a wonderful introduction, so thank you. I won't bother doing that. Just some housekeeping, if I may, while we start. If you're looking for a bathroom, you just need to wander out into the foyer and you'll find one. And if you can turn your phones to silent now, that would be greatly appreciated. But what a 24 hours we have had. For those who have been perusing the budget books, it can feel like a bit of a hangover today. Of course, the state government wants us to look at that big $12 billion spend on healthcare. They want you to look at how many nurses we're hiring and AMBOs and, of course, police officers. But today we're going to delve down a little bit further to see what the budget's social policies include. That's why we're all here. And that is what is important today. But after that, after we hear from the Treasurer shortly, it'll be your turn. We'll have some roving mics around the room. So if something annoyed you in the budget, that's your chance to put your hand up and ask the Treasurer directly. But you're not alone in this room today. Very 2020, there are people joining us online. They're looking through the website. If you are watching online, if you go to the bottom of the video that you're seeing now, you'll be able to pop a question in. And if there's anyone from the state opposition watching online, you can submit your questions to the Treasurer anonymously. So they can do that if they choose to do so. But just pop your hand up and someone will come around. If you are using social media today, if you can hashtag VCOSS breakfast to any of your tweets or your posts, that would be greatly appreciated. But I will now introduce the Victorian Treasurer, Mr. Tim Pallas.
Things are moving quickly though. First of all, I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Look, it is really a great pleasure to be here to once again join a VCOSS breakfast. I'd like to take, first of all, a moment to thank everyone in this room for the amazing job you've all done in very difficult circumstances for this community. The work that you do in supporting Victorians, particularly those Victorians who are most in need and at risk of impoverishment and isolation from the rest of the community, is an outstanding commitment and demonstration of it. And I hope, at least to some extent, in the circumstances that we confront, we've demonstrated that as a government, we too share your values, and to the extent we can, we make a commitment to your incredibly worthy undertakings. So the last 2 years have challenged governments in a way that I don't think anybody could have foreseen. I often tell people I've been Treasurer for 8 years, and the first 6 were pretty good. Last 2, well, not so much. But you know, you don't create, in many cases, the events that sometimes surround us. And the measure of a real government, a government that is focused on its principal priorities, and those, of course, for a Labor government, the Andrews Labor government, are very much around protecting the well-being and the welfare of the community. That's our number one priority. I hope this budget lives those values large, but it's also about recognising that governments have to confront the circumstances that present themselves, and they have to live their values large in order to protect the community and to give them the opportunity to prevail and to prosper going forward. So, of course, confronted by a global pandemic in Victoria, the government decided that it was our responsibility to act decisively. You may have heard that on occasion I've criticised the federal government for going missing during a lot of these times, and as they disappeared from view, of course, increasingly the state, and not just this state, other states had to become increasingly more involved in protecting the community and performing roles that, quite frankly, were not normally seen as being state roles. And in doing that, we stepped up and we provided $44 billion of support to the health system, to save jobs and to protect the community. It created the foundations for Victoria's recovery, to be honest, and if you look at the November budget, 2020 budget, again the May 2021 budget, and finally today's budget, I think you'll see a continuum of focus and effort. We can't just simply see the circumstances that confront the state of Victoria as a crisis and ultimately just seek to apply a bandage to the problem as it presents. We have to make profound structural change to the way our economy operates. We know, for example, that the demonstration and the onset of the pandemic has proved our public health effort needs to step up and be substantially more in an ongoing sense than we've seen historically. We also know that insecurity of work is one of the scourges that required, in many ways, people who needed to isolate not to be able to do so, and that in itself created even more problems. So I believe that the budgets, the 3 budgets since the onset of the pandemic, have really created the foundations for Victoria's recovery. And quite frankly, can I say that that recovery has exceeded our expectations. I won't say my expectations because, well, I'm a professional pessimist, so it would probably come as no surprise that I've been surprised. But it has been quite amazing how profound the improvement in our material circumstances have been. So the budget I handed down yesterday puts patients first, and it's really about this government living its values large. We understand that Victorians need help. They need a government that's prepared to make an effort and an investment in their well-being, and that's exactly what we've done. The budget also supports our recovery, and it'll help Victoria bounce back. It'll deliver our pandemic repair plan. It'll build a world-class education system. It'll create decent and secure jobs. It'll get Victorians home sooner and safer. It'll help families. It'll make Victoria fairer, and it'll build stronger communities. So the Victorian economy suffered quite an extraordinary shock due to the pandemic, as did jurisdictions right across the globe. But we're confident of a quick bounce back, and I'm pleased to say it's been even faster than predicted. Every politician you talk to during the course of the pandemic will give you the trite line that you should never waste a crisis. I'm not sure that many of them had any idea what that actually meant, but it didn't mean trying to segregate and separate people. It meant looking at opportunities to bring a community together, get some singularity of focus and some effort around the problems that our economy and our community had particularly been brought into sharp context during the course of the pandemic. So employment has risen by 280,000 jobs since the September 2020, the lowest point, the nadir of the economic cycle, if I could put it that way, and it's forecast to keep growing strongly. The unemployment rate is the lowest since current records began, and labour force participation is at a near record high. For me, it's particularly pleasing to see that the recovery in the labour market has been inclusive. Women, young people and single parents were most adversely affected during the COVID-19 outbreaks in both 2020 and 2021, and I'm pleased to say that earlier this year, the proportion of workers amongst these groups had recovered to above the pre-pandemic levels. And I want to basically put this into the broad sweep of the economic revitalisation of the state. If you think about it this way, about 560,000 jobs have been created in this state since the government came to office. That's about 1 in 6 jobs in the total employment pool in this state have been created since this government came to office in November 2014. The thing that really thrills me about it is about 4 in 5 of those jobs have been full-time jobs. And that overturns what has been a decades-long movement towards insecure employment in the labour market. COVID-19, of course, has put unprecedented pressure on health systems around the world, including ours. This budget delivers a $12 billion pandemic repair plan, delivering more staff, better hospitals and first-class care. Key investments delivered in this budget include $2.4 billion for more hospital staff and to support new wards as they open, $698 million so people can get the care that they need in the comfort of their own home as we continue the Better at Home program. I'll just pick out some of the things that I particularly like in this budget, and this is one of them. It was decades ago that we came up with case mix management, which was about a much more efficient way of delivering healthcare, but there hasn't been much really that's constituted a game changer around the way that health is delivered. Better at Home effectively is just such a game changer in my view. It's about getting care to people in circumstances and in an environment where they feel most comfortable. It's about therefore freeing up the capacity of our hospital system to be able to, of course, deal with the more substantial and intractable health problems that require care in a hospital environment. But ultimately, we do know that if you get care in situ at home, the prognosis and the outcomes are much better. Our investment in health and hospitals will mean that we're training and hiring up to 7,000 healthcare workers, including up to 5,000 nurses. Every Victorian should have confidence that when they call for emergency care, someone will come to help. That's why we're investing $333 million to add 400 new staff, to increase 000 call taking and dispatch capacity, $236 million to double the capacity of the emergency departments at the Casey Hospital and Werribee Mercy Hospital. $124 million will put more paramedics on the road and also improve ambulance performance. Last year we promised we'd fix our broken mental health system by building a new one from the ground up. And of course in that budget, in May of last year, we put in a record $3.8 billion investment. This budget builds on these investments with $1.3 billion to take the next step to implement the recommendations of the Mental Health Royal Commission. A good education, of course, is a foundation for a good life. We're creating a state where every student can learn and achieve, regardless of where they live or the barriers that stand in their way. No matter their background or their postcode, we want every child to have world-class schooling that can give them the key to unlock their best life. So this budget delivers $1.8 billion to deliver 13 new schools and 65 school upgrades, including upgrades to 36 special schools, meaning that since 2015, we will have upgraded every special school in the state. There's $779 million to recruit around 1,900 teachers, the aim being to give them more time to prepare and focus on each individual student's particular needs. And $277 million to transform VCE and VCAL. This is a big policy initiative and an intervention, and something that the Deputy Premier, the Education Minister, should be particularly proud of. It's aimed to help students graduate into a great job and rewarding future. It will be the biggest reform of the VCE since its inception, and it will get away from what I think is an insidious process of discriminating between educational forms, that people with technical prowess are in some way considered second-class students. We need to have an integrated system of education where we recognise and reward technical prowess. We've always prioritised ensuring Victorians have decent, secure jobs. And in this budget, we continue that with the $246 million to fund the sick pay guarantee pilot, $120 million for the Victorian Industry Fund, which is aimed to invest more things right here in Victoria and make more things here in Victoria. So also $353 million to help our creative, tourism and major events industries bounce back from the pandemic, and believe me, they are. The turnaround in the activity in metropolitan Melbourne in particular has been nothing short of profound. So the Andrews Labor government is helping families with a one-off payment of $250 to all Victorian households that use the Energy Compare website. Not only will households save money by finding the best deals, that they'll be rewarded for doing so. Now, this is a program that's been progressively rolled out over some years, and we've had a number of iterations of it. But I've got to tell you, this is more than just a cash grant, as it were. It's about trying to get the community to appreciate that if you don't shop around, you don't get the best deal. And of course, the Energy Minister tells us that there's something in the vicinity of $333 most families will pick up in terms of savings by shopping around. Added to that, $250 for the government to encourage you to start to realise those options. So children, and that is just one of a number of the initiatives that the government has put in this budget to support Victorians with cost of living pressures. Children starting 3-year-old kinder receiving a kinder kit to help parents supporting their children's early learning. $15 million will support neighbourhood houses and community food relief efforts, including the Food Relief Task Force and the expansion of regional food hubs. This builds on our record of helping families through the pandemic with the test isolation payment, the rental assistance grants, and of course free rats. So this budget supports all Victorians regardless of who they are, where they're from and what they believe in. This includes $940 million for programs and services primarily focused on improving outcomes for women. And I must say I'm particularly pleased about our gender-responsive budgeting strategies that have been unveiled in this budget. I know the Minister for Women, Minister Gab Williams, has taken particular focus on this and made sure that this is not a ticker-box process. This is a genuine engagement by the government as it makes its decisions to satisfy itself that it's taken into account the long-run implications of the decisions it's made in terms of getting to a more just and equal society. $400 million has been put aside to support Victoria's Aboriginal community, taking the government's total investment to $1.6 billion. And there are many other initiatives supporting all parts of our diverse Victorian communities. So the Andrews Labor government has invested over $3.5 billion to protect and support Victorian women and children facing family violence. And this budget invests a further $241 million to support victim survivors. That includes $69 million to continue enhanced support to victim survivors in family violence refuges, $43 million for strengthened family violence services, $30 million to enable family violence specialists to continue delivering perpetrator interventions and contribute to an increasing evidence base about what works to change behaviour and to prevent violence. $30 million to continue the central information point to share critical information about risks posed by perpetrators to help keep victim survivors safe. This budget also builds on our commitment to support families and children, providing $272 million to improve services and safety. So this investment includes $85 million to meet demand for residential care and continue the Care Hub program, which supports young people who can't live with their families due to abuse or neglect. Care Hub services help minimise the time young Victorians spend in care and reunify them with their families sooner. $58 million to support up to 1,000 additional vulnerable families and to strengthen child protection responses by increasing support staff capacity. $7.2 million to support culturally safe services for Aboriginal children in child protection and the continuation of the Aboriginal Children and Families Innovation and Learning Fund. So the budget also, as I previously indicated, makes a $400 million to our First Nations people, and those investments include $151 million invested to continue our support for our nation-leading treaty process, $36 million to deliver assessments for the protection of significant Aboriginal Victorian cultural heritage sites, $7.2 million including support to continue the Aboriginal Children and Families Innovation and Learning Fund, $5.8 million to continue joint land management of the Barmah National Park, $5.8 million to deliver educational programs in schools that support learning and understanding of self-determination for Victorian Aboriginal communities, $3.9 million to support returning water to traditional owners for cultural, spiritual and economic use, $2.8 million to support the delivery of the Certificate 4 in teaching a First Nations language, and $2.2 million to support the Lake Tyers and Framlingham Aboriginal Trust. So the budget also makes investments to ensure that Victorians are treated with respect as they age, and the key investments contained in this respect include $146 million to build new public sector residential aged care facilities in Camperdown, Mansfield and Orbost, and also there's planning to redevelop the Bright and Haywood aged care facilities, $30 million for places in public residential aged care, $3 million for a range of initiatives that support social recovery programs for older Victorians and carers, $2.9 million to continue the elder abuse prevention network, addressing family violence for older Victorians and stopping it from happening, and $800,000 for the design and planning of a 60-bed public sector residential aged care services facility in Mornington. Our community services sector workers have gone above and beyond for Victorians during the course of the pandemic, and as I've said in my introduction, we can't, as a government, thank you enough for what you do to support those who need it most. We've heard from you that prices were rising and that this budget provides an uplift locked in over the forward estimates to help manage that. The one thing we've consistently heard from VCOSS and others in the sector is we need the certainty of funding going forward. And hopefully this goes some way towards addressing those concerns. Funding for the sector will be increased by $90 million over 4 years to support increasing wages across its workforce and other operating costs. So this responds directly to advocacy from VCOSS and embeds indexation for these costs into the budget for the first time, giving certainty that we know the sector has been asking for. Workforce shortages in the broader community services sector will be addressed with a $5 million set of scholarships to increase the pipeline of graduates, and also $2 million to recruit workers considering a career in community services sector. So we're committed to continuing working with the unions and the social and community services sector to introduce a fair jobs code in the sector to improve issues with workforce shortages and job insecurity, while continuing to discuss issues such as indexation and funding. And can I say, the government accepts if a code is of value to us in this sector, then we understand that we have to bring value to the table as part of that process of engagement. The Andrews Labor government has a record of delivering for Victorians who need it most. As we know, the key to meaningful change for families and communities is early support when people first reach out for help, well before they reach crisis point. I was really proud to introduce the Early Intervention Investment Framework in last year's budget. It is a nation leading and also, I think, at the cutting edge of international budgeting processes. This year, we're going further and adding and investing $504 million to address problems earlier, getting Victorians help and support sooner. Intervening early not only helps individuals and their families, it reduces the need for more acute and costly services. Investments this year support students in crisis, those suffering mental ill health, persons exiting prison, and those experiencing homelessness. So the budget invests in more of the services and the support that Victorians need, including $5.7 billion into our rural and regional communities. In addition to the schools, hospitals and transport upgrades I've already outlined, there's also $196 million to replace and expand the mental health facilities at Goulburn Valley Health in Shepparton, and planning for 2 more. $146 million for 3 new public sector residential aged care facilities in Camperdown, Mansfield and Orbost, $30 million for the Regional Jobs and Infrastructure Fund, $30 million for tourism infrastructure projects across regional Victoria. I'll finish there. I'm sure our Auslan interpreter has probably got RSI by now, but there are many other initiatives that I haven't mentioned that will continue to support our remarkable recovery. At its heart, this is a budget that looks after the health and the well-being of every single Victorian. This is a Labor budget, one that I'm very proud to have had a hand in producing. It invests in the hospitals and the healthcare our state needs, and the Victorian workers we need to deliver it. It's a budget that delivers more staff, better hospitals and first-class care. This is a budget that puts patients first. Finally, this is where you get to pay for your meal if you haven't already. And really, every budget, I have a budget charity. For any cynics in the room, this is not something that the state of Victoria uses taxpayers' funds for. I put my hand in my own pocket, and I hope that you well and truly dwarf my miserly contribution to the Treasurer's charity for the budget, and I'd really appreciate you looking at OzHarvest. It's a fantastic charity. I'd encourage you, as an organisation, of course, they fight against food waste through its food rescue, education and sustainability work. It truly is a great charity, and one that I'd encourage you to think about making a contribution to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Treasurer and to our Auslan interpreters who joined us on the daily Premier press conferences. So well seasoned in, he's exhausted. You've done a wonderful job. Thank you. So it is now time to apply some pressure, if we can, to the Treasurer by asking questions. He's already sat down. He's ready for breakfast. I was trying to time my eating to when he was going to finish talking. It was difficult. I was trying to scoff some food. We'll let him have a drink. But there are roving mics that will be going around, so you can pop your hand up and ask a question. There's already one hand that's gone up here. Don't forget you can also ask questions online. I might just start, Treasurer, though, by asking you what the decision was to... You don't have a mic. You can come up. I might ask you just about the $250 energy bonus and why the decision was made not to means test that.
Well, there's two reasons. One, sometimes you can find means testing is quite an expensive process to put in place, particularly state governments who don't have access to income. It's a good idea. Maybe I could think about an income tax strategy, but I don't think it would be well received somehow. So we don't really have that data. The second reason is there's a public policy objective that we're seeking to achieve here, and that is to encourage people to shop around when it comes to energy. And it really doesn't matter whether you're a low-income earner or whether you have more substantial means. It's about greater competition in the market. That driving that greater competition opens up, hopefully, more efficient distribution and retail companies, but it also inculcates a mentality in the community that says we're going to drive the best price for our energy year on year going forward. So yes, it's a one-off payment, but it's about changing attitudes, shopping around, getting the best return, and hopefully getting a much more competitive market in the retailers.
Great. We'll get you to stay there if we can, and we'll take some questions from the floor. If you can just introduce yourself and then go with your question.
Good morning, everybody. Jenny Smith from the Council to Homeless Persons. Thank you, Treasurer. Treasurer, we know in Victoria that we have a Treasurer who really gets what it takes to end homelessness, you know, with the big housing build and with the funding of Homeless to Home. We told 1,845 rough sleepers that they would have a forever home and the support that they need to keep it. $55 million will do that, $12 million will not. We told our sector that if they stood this service up, exhausted as they were after putting people in and out of hotels, that they would be in a position to provide a service for at least 1,845 people ongoing to introduce housing first more systemically into the state. We know that if we don't have these services, that these people will be patients first and costing net the community around $13,500 more than we're spending on them. So I can't fathom it. I don't understand why you have cut homeless to a home.
Well, can I make the point first up that as a government, we've invested, as I say, $700 million in homelessness services since we've come to government. We also made a pretty substantial effort during the course of the pandemic to put every body who was homeless into accommodation. And I've got to say it's a source of incredible frustration to me that we seem to not be getting to the outcomes that we'd achieved, because essentially we'd identified that cohort of people who needed support, and we needed to better wrap around services around their needs going forward. There's $75 million in this budget aimed at, once again, improving homelessness services. I think it's a little unfair to compare the peak COVID response funding to what constitutes an ongoing need. But I'll be very clear, from our perspective, we've said to, I've spoken to the Minister for Homelessness, Richard Wynne, and I've made it very clear we support the idea as a government of dealing with these issues and dealing with them in a substantial and game-shifting way. We need the strategies coming forward that will assist us in doing that. There's $25 million in this budget for a social bond process that hopefully the sector can come up with strategies to assist. But that's not the end of it. Richard, for example, has a housing program, a homelessness housing program out in Flemington, which I think there was some concern in the sector was ceasing. It is not. It will continue for another 12 months. He just doesn't need the funding, so he didn't make a bid for additional funding in this budget. So, look, we accept that there is more work to do. I just have to say that we've got to come up with strategies that actually shift the game. I can't get back to a position where, as a government, we put a lot of money into a Band-Aid that ultimately doesn't give us a long-term structural change in dealing with this. And we know that there are examples around the world that work. So building housing, providing wraparound support will get us there. But I need the support and the services and the capacity in the sector to be able to do that. When I'm convinced that we've got a strategy that we all agree on, and of course the Homelessness Minister is very much focused on this, I can assure you that the government stands prepared to act. And we believe, of course, that we haven't put $700 million into this area simply to see it fail. We want to come up with solutions that shift the dial on this, and we are all seeing a representation of homelessness on our streets when we had, fortuitously, one of the few positive outcomes of the COVID process was that we had been able to massively shift the dial. We have to find ways of locking it in, and as a government we're committed to doing that.
Damien Ferry from the board of VCOSS. I know that I speak on behalf of all our members, Treasurer, in acknowledging the gratitude that the government has showed to our sector that has responded so magnificently over the last couple of years in particular, and we're grateful for that. And we acknowledge the $90 million in indexation, which is in the budget papers. What VCOSS has been very keen to do with government is to, for the last forever, we have not known from year to year what is the methodology that can guarantee and ensure that we have a methodology that understands, at least within the forward estimates, that understands what indexation looks like, what the methodology is around that, to give us some certainty to ensure that we can plan in the way that any organisation needs to plan for its future, rather than this 12-month episodic process. We don't understand the methodology around the 90 million. We're very grateful for it, but we would like to have a commitment that we can work through this in a very systematic and, I guess, disciplined way that gives certainty to our members.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. Look, can I say we've made some progress? It may not be to the full extent of your ambitions in this area. I think the $90 million that we put aside is about 2.55% to 2.69% thereabouts in terms of annualised adjustment. What we, given the circumstances that we're in, $17 billion worth of deficit in the 21-22 financial year, it's a pretty substantial demonstration of our priorities that we're using our balance sheet to assist the community sector. And I know very much that it's difficult to plan year to year if that's all you've got. But I've got to tell you, I feel your pain at the moment. I've been doing a bit of year-to-year planning the way that the economy's been bouncing around quite profoundly. But so the big outcome in this budget for this sector is essentially 4 years' worth of guaranteed indexation adjustment. The issue becomes exactly whether or not that is in the long term an adequate number. We're up for a discussion, but it's a baseline on that conversation. So we'll have further discussions with you. I think the thing that does worry me a little bit is that we also do need to recognise that we have to be prepared to drive efficiency in this sector. If effectively you're guaranteed of an indexation amount, we've got to be assured, therefore, that there is some return effectively in terms of the performance of the industry. And I know that that is not what you want to hear from a treasurer. It makes me sound very pointy-headed, but I am currently oversighting a wages policy as the Industrial Relations Minister of this state, where effectively all I'm guaranteeing is 1.5% of wage adjustments to public servants. It's probably a pretty hard number that we've put in place, and we've done it for a very good reason. We effectively need to demonstrate that as a government we're serious about winding back our consistent outlays, and pretty much we've locked in almost all of our workforce into those agreements for, well, the next 3 or 4 years. So we're in a position where we've been pretty substantial in terms of the insistence on efficiency and winding back our recurrent costs. All that said, I do accept that this is not an industry that or an undertaking where the government should be driving efficiency at the expense of welfare. So we won't do that. We'll use this as a baseline for conversations, and we'll see where it leads us to.
I believe there's a gentleman on table 12 that has the mic. Or will you? Sure.
Hi, Treasurer. Sarah Toohey from the Community Housing Industry Association. There's $1 billion in low-cost loans and finance to the community housing sector in the budget this year, which is fantastic. But low-cost loans and finance don't allow us to drive rents right down to social housing levels. With the big housing build expiring in 23-24, it feels unfair to ask you about future budgets, but what is the plan, post-big housing build, to secure a pipeline of social housing in Victoria?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the Housing Minister's got a lot of work on his plate at the moment. Secondly, I think the one thing this government has very much been focused on is recognising that we can't just deal with one cohort, one presentation of the problem in the housing market, whether it be the rental market or people getting into their first home, or whether it be a much more substantial social and public housing strategy. So the $5.3 billion that we put aside for our big housing build is about trying to make a substantial and dramatic intervention in this space. Where does that lead us to into the future? I suppose we are in the process of reviewing our strategies as a consequence of the social housing levy that the government did propose, but the industry reacted adversely to it and looked like they were lining up to run a scare campaign, that there was going to be a massive increase in home prices as a consequence. So we won't be proceeding with that levy. now or at any time in the future. Can I be very clear about that? But we will now have to review exactly how we can get to a position where we can have some certainty about funding going forward. At the moment, I'm sorry I can't give you that certainty, but we are very conscious about the need to provide that certainty going forward. And I might say the industry, I think, is a little focused on the fact that they had an opportunity for a singular approach right across the board rather than the council by council levy approach. It was never about increasing the costs for industry. In fact, there was $700 million worth of planning reform that went hand in hand with this package. So from our perspective, we're going to have further engagement with the industry and the community groups that are very much focused on this area to see what constitutes a measure of consensus about where we go into the future. We haven't landed it yet because, well, our plans have been somewhat derailed.
Thank you, Treasurer. My name is Glenn Krutoff from Quantum Support Services, and a pleasure to be here today. Firstly, thank you for your commitment to $75 million for tailored homelessness support and $504 million for your pathway to help chronic homelessness that we heard today. Seems a topic today is homelessness across the board, but I think it's an issue and intersectionality that we deal with on a daily basis that certainly needs a solution, as you pointed out. Specifically, thank you again for your examples of the investment that you're making in regional Victoria. Specifically, is there any of this funding that's set aside for Gippsland region specifically and for the increase in supply of social housing through the big build in that space?
Well, I think you might be asking me to go a little bit too much into the
I thought so,
detail.
but I thought, hey, I'll take my chance.
But look, I'll have a crack around the broader issues of the government's investment in regional Victoria. Well over $5 billion of investment in regional Victoria in this budget. The way I like to look at it is if you compare our term in office, this is a little unfair because we've been in government approaching 8 years and the previous government's 4 years, we've invested 5 times more in regional Victoria. So 250% on a year-by-year basis increase in funding to regional Victoria, to put it simply. There certainly, we're putting funds into aged care facilities in Orbost and Mansfield, and I think another 3 aged care facilities, publicly run aged care facilities in the state. In practical terms around social housing and public housing, I think I'll have to demur to the expertise of the Housing Minister, but there is a very substantial contribution. We've made it clear that our aims is to ensure that around 20 to 25% of our investment in public housing and social housing in the big build goes into regional Victoria, and I'm sure Gippsland will get their fair share.
We've got questions from online.
Good morning, Treasurer. Ryan Shields from VCOSS. I actually have a question from the live stream though, and I'll just encourage all those viewers on the live stream to keep those questions coming. This one's from Tanya Kovac from Gen Vic, and she asks, this is the first budget with a fully operational Gender Equality Act and the Gender Responsive Budgeting Unit in place. What have you learnt about the importance of a gender lens applied to the Victorian finances, and what does the future hold in this space?
Well, look, I think the first thing I'd say is quite often you don't appreciate that the decisions you make in some of the less apparent areas do have a gender impact. For example, what have I learned? I've learned a lot since becoming Treasurer in this space, but the one thing that really brought it home to me was your public transport times and priorities. It has a dramatic effect if all you're doing is dealing with peak hour services at the expense of non-peak services, because that has an adverse effect upon women, principally, who have responsibilities to move around that are not during that 9 to 5 peak. But that's just one of a multitude. The construction of, I don't know, bike sheds at train stations. You wouldn't have thought, I wouldn't have thought, it hadn't even occurred to me. I mean, I get on a bike once every year and fall off. But it hadn't really occurred to me that when you build a bike shed, you have to have an exit point, an access and an exit point, and a lighting system that automatically deals with people coming in, because women don't feel safe in them unless there's that prominent display of the facility so that they can move in and out safely. So it goes to our infrastructure design as well as the way that we provide services. I've got to say, I'm on a rapid learning course here, and I think that ultimately the one thing that we are served exceptionally well with is having so many women in our cabinet and in our caucus. More than 50% of the cabinet of the government are women, and slightly less, I think 47% of our caucus are women. But I'll give you an example of how that helps just in day-to-day conversation. When we're talking about ideas, one of our ministers, while we were looking at the COVID restrictions and how you basically isolate during the course of a contact in your household, at one point, one of our ministers, as we were moving to the idea that people don't need necessarily to be isolated, and how you isolate younger people, one of our ministers said, well, look, my son, I think it was her son, got COVID, and she basically had to stay at home with him, and she got COVID as a consequence. And she said, you don't really appreciate, when you make rules like this, you've got to understand that mothers can't not be around a young child who's not feeling well. And to say that the individual must isolate themselves within the house is meaningless in that context. So it's a perspective that I don't think too many of the men brought to the table.
There's a question over here on table 9, I believe. Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, Treasurer. Catherine Ellis from the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria. Firstly, congratulations and thank you for all the hard work that your government has put in over the last 2 years to keep Victoria running and bouncing back. For young people, I'm sure you would acknowledge that young people have done it very tough over the last couple of years and have probably made more sacrifices than most in the community in terms of their education, their social connections, their community activities, all kinds of things. We were really pleased to see in the budget the investments in the education system, which will benefit a lot of young people, and some of the other initiatives. What we did see as a gap, though, is recognition of the fact that there are many young people who are not in the education system because either they've dropped out or they have aged out. You know, young people we consider up to 25. And a lot of them are really struggling at the moment because of the impacts of COVID, but also the cost of living pressures. And we didn't see a lot in the budget for those young people and for supporting those young people. And we really like to understand your perspective on investing in community services, which is where a lot of those young people turn. There's a lot in the budget in terms of crisis, child protection, mental health, crime prevention, those kind of things. We'd love to see some more investment upstream in youth work, particularly in rural and regional communities where youth workers fill the gap that is there because services aren't nearly as accessible as they are in the cities. But also just generally understanding the importance of youth workers and people who act as youth workers in sports clubs and in school environments, in other places, in supporting young people, in providing prevention and early intervention services that in the end save a lot of money down the track in crisis services. I know there's a youth strategy coming down the pipe. We've been waiting for it for a while. Really keen to hear some positive words from you today about where this is all heading.
Yeah, thanks very much. Gosh, there's a lot in that. First and foremost, I think I'd accept the basic proposition that young people have particularly had to endure a difficult time as everybody's tried to pull together and keep the community safe as we develop vaccines and strategies to deal with the onset of COVID as an endemic part of the society. And I've got to say, I don't say that with any satisfaction at all. We would have much preferred to have been in a position where eradication could have been a strategy and we could be rid of the virus, but we're not rid of it and we probably never will be. It's going to be part of the ongoing challenges that we as a community confront. But yes, young people have particularly suffered quite egregiously in this, and they will nonetheless have a very substantial long tail to the sacrifice that they've had to make, and that of course goes in part to the debt burden that the state carries. In my speech, I revisited my favourite ancient Greek proverb, which basically says society functions best when old people plant the seeds of trees, the shade of which they know they will never rest beneath. That is, we function best when we're making investments in a future that might not be relevant to us, but is relevant for future generations. And certainly that's entirely what the early intervention investment framework is about. It's about trying to find those interventions that we can make, whether it's around homelessness, whether it's around avoidance of young people getting caught in the justice system, or many other problems associated with mental health, for example. The Navigator program, which we put some money into in this budget, is about also trying to find ways to better connect young people and keep them connected into the education system going forward. And as a government, I think we recognise that the best possible start you can give somebody is to keep them connected into education, but also to recognise that there's no such thing as a single pathway to a good education. That's why we're getting to the position of trying to do away with the idea of VCAL and VCE and start talking about training for skill. And that's why I think we do lose a lot of young people. They don't see themselves as being necessarily academically proficient, and they walk away from the education system per se. Our Head Start apprenticeships, which are incorporated within the budget, will mean that every state-run secondary school will be able to offer what is effectively a year 13 for people undertaking apprenticeships. It's about making sure that we don't just provide for young people who are looking for a completion of their VCE year to go into university from there and to get skills. It's about keeping connected with young people into education by providing them with a range of opportunities and not seeking to pigeonhole them and tell them there's a second-class form of education. The broader question you asked around, well, how do we keep connected through our investment in social services and young people where they interact, whether it be in sporting areas or elsewhere, I think is a point well made. And one of the big troubles or problems that we're all confronting at the moment is we are looking like we've got a workforce problem in this area. We just don't have enough people to deal with the social needs of the community at the moment, whether it be in mental health, whether it be youth engagement, or more broadly in broader social welfare concerns. So the government is, as you'd appreciate, making investments in terms of training places to get the skills into the community. That's why we put free TAFE in place. Hopefully that encourages people into these areas of training, but there's still a lot more to do.
I think we've got time for one more question, just here.
Thank you. Jenna Chia from Volunteering Victoria here. As you're probably aware, volunteers are the foundation of our community sector. Pre-COVID, 2.3 million Victorians volunteer, contributing $58 billion or more to the economy, and with profound benefits on community wellbeing and resilience. Despite this, their contribution is often taken for granted. Now, in this budget, there doesn't appear to be any direct funding to address declining volunteer rates or the systemic issues impacting volunteers. Can you explain a bit about the government's intent and plan to support Victoria's volunteers?
I think there was a little bit in the budget for keeping people connected into volunteering. at the risk of being contradicted here, I think it was $2 to $3 million. So it's a relatively small and modest contribution, but we do recognise the value that volunteers make. We've given money to the VCOSS and to the CFA for their continued efforts in terms of volunteerism in the community as well. Look, we know that society can't function without volunteers. I can tell you as a treasurer, if I had to pay for the services that are provided by volunteers, well, my budgetary problems would be even more profound than the challenges that we confront at the moment. So they are recognised for their services, and I'm happy for my office to just take you through directly what is contained in the budget and what our ambitions for the future look like.
Great. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for all of your questions, and thank you for taking them, Treasurer. I'll invite Emma King back up on stage.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the VCOSS board, our members and friends, etc. in the room, Treasurer, I want to say a very sincere thank you. And I know at times we'll have robust conversations around things that we agree or disagree on, but one of the things I really appreciate about our relationship with you and your office is that we can have those and actually look at how we progress forward, and also feel, I think, really enormously proud of the collective effort that's been made. And I would call out in particular the last few years that has been incredibly difficult for Victoria, and the way that we've been able to work together during that time. I think they're the things that stand us in good stead for the future. We have been so excited around announcements in previous budgets around things like the big housing build, the mental health reforms, the family violence reforms, etc. So we know there is so much that stands us in good stead as we shift forward. So I want to particularly acknowledge the relationship that we have with you, with your office, with the Andrews government, because it is something that we do not take for granted. Now, in terms of Victoria's number plates, if you remember, used to have Victoria on the move, and we very much hope that Victoria is on the move once again as we're moving post-COVID. And as you know, VCOSS in the community sector is very focused on wellbeing, and we're on the move, we hope, towards a wellbeing economy. So it was a small gift of thanks today and a reminder of that bold and positive aspiration, and to remind you that VCOSS is always here to work with you. We have some new number plates made up of Victoria, the wellbeing state, and we have two of those for you, as well as a small card. But we hope that this sets a tone for as we move forward. We are very mindful that this has been a budget in an election year, and this is what we want to see going forward. So sincere thank you, Treasurer. Thank you. And we know the Treasurer has another appointment at 9 o'clock, I think, and has to head off. So a sincere thank you again to the Treasurer, and making the time to come. And we know it's always that balancing act each budget where different priorities are emphasised, but having the time to ask questions, etc. today has been fantastic and much appreciated. Before I hand back to Sharnelle, I also want to invite Stephen Reilly from HESTA up on stage. HESTA is a very good friend of VCOSS, and I think of everyone in this room and for all of those who are listening online today as well. Events like today would not be possible without the support of HESTA, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Note to self, never follow Emma King. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to other Indigenous people present and watching online. HESTA is extremely proud to be involved in the Treasurer's Breakfast and has been a proud supporter of this for many years. And I would like to acknowledge the Treasurer. It's a tough gig and someone's got to do it. So well done. But we are particularly proud to be able to acknowledge the work that VCOSS and all of the organisations and people in this room do across the community about the reality that so many of you face into and meet head on every day. I was talking to my wife last night about the work VCOSS does, and she reminded me about a quote from the 30s, this is what my wife does, and that she thought might be helpful today. And it goes, the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. So what does that mean? Well, it's a comment on the difference between perceptions of reality, representations of reality, and reality. The map is the picture, symbols on paper, squiggly lines, which try to describe a landscape. The territory is the land itself, the terrain, the hills, the valleys, the flowers, the beauty. It's also the crags, the brambles, the cliffs, the challenges, the homeless, the jobless, the disadvantaged. Sorry, I lost my place. I was got on a roll. But the territory is the work that Emma King and her team look into every day. The territory is the strong advocacy and the strengthening of the community that the people in this room do every day. It's the incredible work that people do to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. HESTA's purpose is to invest in and for those people who make the world better. People like you in this room, people who live and breathe the territory. To that end, we've been partnering with Health and Community Services for over 30 years, and we manage the retirement savings now of more than 900,000 members, which equates to some $68 billion. We're a not-for-profit fund created specifically for the health and community services sector. So our only goal is to make a real difference to the financial future, to the lives, to the territory of every one of our members by being a gutsy advocate for them and driving meaningful change for generations to come. And you know, in superannuation circles, we're about as gutsy as it gets. But I'm not sure I can hold a candle to some of the gutsy advocates in this room. You can always rely on VCOSS, and for that matter, we have a representative from ACOSS on our board, to have a strong and thoughtful view and strong and gutsy advocacy. So we feel that HESTA is a good match for VCOSS. We are privileged to be your partner here today and honoured to manage the money of anyone here today. HESTA continues to invest in the social infrastructure we will need to meet the challenges of the future. Challenges like our ageing population, transitioning to a low-carbon future, and ensuring we value and support our critical health and community and social services so we're prepared to face future shocks like we've seen in the past 2 years. We will continue to join our voices with organisations like VCOSS to push for a more equitable, inclusive and just Australia. We do so because we know that this will produce a more secure, sustainable financial future for our members and a better world, a better territory, a better reality for them to retire into. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. HESTA is very proud and honoured to sponsor this event. I hope you enjoy the rest of the function. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. I've noticed that the Treasurer has left his books behind. I might take them. They'll be safely returned to the state government. No one have any doubt. We're here to collect them. Almost. We are going to jump straight into a panel discussion now, if everyone is wired up. I believe they are. And we can look at what the Treasurer said, or perhaps what he didn't say. Let me introduce to you leading economist Dr. Angela Jackson, who is also a board member for Gen Vic and the Women in Economics Network. And also RMIT Professor David Hayward, another seasoned budget analyst. Yes, we can clap him too. And of course, Emma King. I'm not going to introduce you, but we can clap her though. That's great, yeah. Now, if we can begin just to get some of your reactions to what the Treasurer said today, if that's okay, and what you thought of the budget. We'll start with yourself, Angela.
Yeah, look, obviously, coming out of the pandemic, it's a difficult time, and it's a difficult time for any government to be fashioning budgets in this space. Obviously, governments across Australia and across the world, in a matter of fact, have gone into significant amounts of debt. And really now it's about managing the transition back to normality. I think for the Victorian government and for state governments more generally across Australia, that transition is made more difficult by, I guess, the health overhang. So we've seen, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic was a health pandemic, but we see coming out of that, the demand for services has really elevated. And the trends that were present before the pandemic, where we've seen greater demand for services, greater acuity of people seeking services, have really almost there's been a hyper growth in that, and that's caused a lot of stress. So I guess from the perspective of this sector and from social services in particular, the real risk here is, of course, that health took up $12 billion yesterday just to keep the motors running. So it's not even around necessarily an expansion of services, it's just meeting the demand that's there. And as we look to truly try and invest and drive that growth and really deliver the services that we know can deliver such better outcomes, there is a risk, I think, for the sector that there simply won't be that money available to keep these investments going. So for me, yesterday was really good. I think they did a good job of balancing the need to get the budget back onto a sustainable footing post-pandemic, while still addressing some of those needs. But the risks really are there going forward, that unless we address particularly the issues around the health sector, with the fundamental reform that people have been talking about for a generation now, we are going to see, as the population ages, as we see this acuity, which in my mind is driven by a number of factors, but I think what we're seeing really is 30 years of chronic disease rising across our community, leading to ever increasing increases in not just demand, and I think that's it really is a lot sicker. People are getting to hospital, they're really sick, and much sicker than they have been in the past. Unless we really reform that and do the prevention piece, this problem is just going to go on, and we're going to see budget after budget meeting the crisis rather than preventing people getting to that point. David.
Oh, thank you. My microphone fell off before, and I'm not sure if it's still working, but I think it is. Look, thanks very much. I think it's important to kind of put the budget in historical context. And looking back from the late 80s through to the last 2 or 3 years, there's been an agenda that was set by the Kennett government back in the early 1990s that made debt and deficits look really bad. And talking to the journalists yesterday, certainly the ones who could remember the Kennett era, I think we could all see that there's been a big shift. So Labor is shifting an understanding of debts and deficits. They're really requiring us to think not just about what the debt is, but what the debt's being used for. So it's a big shift in the analysis. So they're saying, look, the money is being used for investment. If it's not for buildings or for freeways or whatever it is, it's investing in people, in health, to get people back into work, to make sure that they've gotten through a pandemic. It's the first time that we've been able to connect up funding or financing with what it is that money is being used to pay for. It's the first time in a generation. It's a big shift. To give you some idea of the magnitude of this shift, for years doing these budget lockups, I've been totting up the annual amount of money that the government allocates for new social initiatives, and it's been sitting at around about 800 million, a billion. I think in the last budget before the pandemic was about 1.8 billion, maybe 2 billion. Once the pandemic hit, the new social initiatives were increased to around about 11 billion. Right? It was a massive increase in that first budget. I remember I thought, this is just unbelievable that they've done this. This financial year hasn't finished yet. Now, yesterday's budget added an additional 6 billion to what was already on the table. It's taking new social initiatives up to about 21 billion in one financial year. Like, the numbers are literally gobsmacking. They're huge. Next year, it'll come back down to about 5 billion. But believe me, these are the really good times for this sector. And I think to pick up on Angela's point, what's happening with state Labor is that they're trying to rethink social spending around investment. How can you reposition it? You heard the Treasurer talk in what I thought was a reasonable attempt to answer your very good question, Jenny, about what's happening with spending on homeless. He's trying to say, look, we're trying to reposition it, so it's not just about consumption, it's how can it be spent to get a return over time, and he's looking for more evidence of that. That's what this budget is about, is trying to reposition social spending so it's not, and Paul, I know you've been talking about this, we've talked about this before, thinking about social spending as investment, not consumption. How can we reimagine it to make it clear to people that there is a dividend down the track? So it's a really important inflection point for Victorian politics right now, and it's a game changer. Whether it works or not, we'll find out in November. I've got my fingers crossed.
Emma. Thank you. I think one of the things that struck me, there's a couple of things that struck me yesterday, I think, with sitting with my colleagues in the lockup. Some of it was around the language, around put patients first. And I thought, and it interests me actually because one of the ministers who stood up at the lockup said put people first. And I thought, I reckon that's what it should be. We don't want, I mean, we recognise it because of the pandemic. Like, we are in such unusual times. And looking at the pressure that is on a government. And I was sitting there reflecting last night and thinking, this is a budget that is a pre-election budget. I think there's a component of investing in key areas where it's seen that where the votes are. So in terms of people want to know that if they ring 000, they're going to have their services delivered. If they go to hospital, they're going to be able to go to hospital. Actually, some really great investments in the education system that I would not want to take away from for a second, including from the early years and the continuation of 3-year-old kinder to the secondary reforms. But I think for me, what I'm really, and I feel like they're very much focused around that prevention and early intervention. And I think the government has this huge struggle at the moment about how do you deal with this demand and this tipping point when we also want to see a significant investment in how do we stop people getting at that tipping point. So it's tricky in a pandemic because that's where some people are going to end up. But when I read some of the investments that were in the early intervention papers, I thought, gee, to me, they don't feel like early intervention. They feel like people are already a really long way down the track. So how do we actually keep a focus on prevention and early intervention, because we know those investments often are not seen within one budget cycle. So it felt to me like, it's a budget for a pre-election budget and maybe keeping some of the powder dry around what's going to come as well.
The state government could come to you to look at naming number plates and the budget before they put anything out. It'd probably be a good idea. Can I ask each of you what you thought was missing from the budget, what you were looking for that wasn't there, and we'll go in the same order if we can, starting with Angela.
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's fair to say the Victorian government, has had a big agenda over its 8 years, and it's certainly invested a lot. And I think, Emma, you ran through, from mental health last year to domestic violence. I think for me, really, what was missing, and probably this is a difficult thing to criticise them for, was that reform agenda. So I think it was really around fixing some problems that are evident and that needed to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's not a criticism. But certainly coming out of the pandemic, and look, the Victorian government, again, to be fair, I think the work around the casual workers and the pilot there, they're trying to do things that the federal government is failing to do in this space. So this is not, I feel like I'm criticising them when really...
That's okay.
If I'm comparing it to the federal sphere, we're worlds apart. But again, I think, coming back to health funding, where are the reforms? Yes, there's the hospital in the home, and that's really important advancement, and clearly it delivers higher quality, lower cost care. But clearly the funding of our hospital system, isn't necessarily sustainable. We've effectively, the Treasurer mentioned case mix funding. In the Victorian hospital sector, we've moved back to block funding effectively because case mix isn't working. Where is that reform agenda to really drive, I guess, these services being efficient? And I think that's, one of the challenges for the sector as well is the Treasurer is indicating, I'm interested in prevention, but we need to make sure that those investments are cost effective. And what are the reforms around that, around the evidence base for doing that? Because I think you could hear today from the Treasurer, it's like, well, we're spending this money, but where's the evidence it's working? And so it would have been good, I think, with that in mind, to spend some money on that as well, to provide, she says as an economist who would possibly do some of this work, but to provide some of that evidence base so that we can ensure that we are investing in those early intervention services, that they are working. Because it's not just about spending money, it's obviously how we're spending that money too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I'd agree with that. But actually, to tell you the truth, yesterday's budget, it massively exceeded my expectations. I thought that there was going to be a lot more tightening because the government has been so very generous during the pandemic. It's outspent all of the other states. It's really outborrowed all of the other states. It's really taken it to a high watermark. I think your point, Angela, I think for the next term, that they're going to have to turn their attention to that, because this isn't, I don't think this is sustainable, this rate of spending, and I think that they will be turning their attention much more to questions of efficiency and what the return will be on the investment. But I think you can see in the budget papers an emerging agenda that is looking towards that type of approach. The other thing that was interesting, and the Treasurer picked it up there today, where's the biggest crisis in the workforce? It's your workforce. Right? You all know it. The Treasurer named it, didn't he? But he only named it a little bit, and there's like money in the budget to help address that. But that care workforce, that's a catastrophe, isn't it? And yet what do we get federally? What do we keep saying with our leaders federally in particular, but it's also to an extent at the states? They want to keep wearing hard hats and yellow vests, don't they? Right? That's not where we got the crisis. It's disability. Actually, just on disability, I'll just give you one of the bugbear of mine. It's markets in the care economy. I don't like them. They don't work. They don't work in energy, and they don't work in the care economy. I've got a place, we had to get the gutters cleaned down at Cape Patterson. I rang a gutter cleaner. He was going to charge me $1,000. I said, $1,000 to clean my gutter? I said, what? He gave me a card. He looked like a movie star. I said, what's going on? He said, oh, I do work for the NDIS. I don't need to clean your gutters. I've got enough business here, so you want me to clean your gutters? I thought, that is absolutely outrageous, because the frontline disability worker won't be getting that sort of money. But that's what happens when you create markets in the care economy. The money goes in, it goes off in all sorts of directions that it shouldn't do. And what happens to the core workforce? We forget about it. So we've got this crisis that has got to be dealt with, and I'd hope that that'll be a top reform agenda for the government in the next term. I also hope it'll be a top reform agenda for the next federal government. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. I'm sorry about that. I get very passionate about those topics. Yeah.
I'm just going to disagree, because I think markets do work, but I think the markets that we have across, yes, disability, aged care, childcare, have been set up incredibly poorly, where it isn't about quality competition, and there does need to be wholesale reform and an increase in wages in the sector. It's just completely and utterly clear that we're not going to be able to meet the future demands and needs of our society unless we increase wages, and that comes at a cost. And I think, at least I think the Victorian government understands that the care economy, delivers for the entire economy, and it is the bedrock by which, if that is not strong, then the rest of us can't work. And I think the pandemic, personally, with an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, showed that if you're caring, you can't work. And so we have to invest in that care economy going forward. But I think markets can work. I just think we've set them up incredibly poorly.
Can I just finish with one point?
I had a feeling we were going to go back.
One of the fastest growing parts of the stock exchange at the moment is investment in care economy infrastructure. So invest in childcare centres, like not the actual delivery of childcare, but the buildings. You can get the Financial Review's been running stories on it. This is where you get a nice little return. But you know what the biggest problem is? They can't get enough childcare workers to staff them to enable them to open them. But think about that. All that money that's leaking out of what should have been a system for delivering childcare is actually delivering handsome returns to investors in property. It shouldn't work that way. The markets don't work, but I'll stop. I'm sorry.
Do I need to check if there's a return serve, or you're okay? Okay. Did you want to add anything before we...
I think one of the things for me that's going to be interesting about the next point, so to add in the what's missing, I think we've heard some of that from the questions, etc., in the room, so I won't repeat them now. But I think it is interesting in terms of the next parts, and the Treasurer alluded to this, and we've had a number of conversations around when we look at our sector more broadly, and we look at funding, and we look at indexation, and we look at contract length, remembering that even the Productivity Commission, which is hardly a left-wing unit, is recommending contracts of up to 7 years. We know we're getting them for 1 year. So all of the preconditions that actually impact on what are the wages in our sector, what are the conditions, how do organisations keep their organisations going, how do we attract the best and the brightest to want to come and work in the community sector, because, as David continues to remind us, this is the fastest growing industry in Victoria and the fastest growing industry in the country. So we've got to actually make sure that we're able to deliver on that, because if we get those preconditions right, that's how we deliver for Victorians. So for me, there's significant levers that sit with government, and we've got a lot of work to do to continue to work on that front. And I know indexation is a pain point for everyone in this room, and there was a tremendous amount of work that's been done in the lead-in and will continue from this point.
Thank you so much. And if I can just give our apologies to people who didn't get their questions to the Treasurer earlier. We were overwhelmed with so many questions, but we do have roving mics if you wanted to ask the panel any questions. We do have a question down the back, if we can go there first.
Thank you. Jennifer Webber from the Caroline Chisholm Society. My question was going to be to the Minister if he'd been here. And it speaks, though, to the issue that you've raised about this reform agenda. So what does this look like in terms of cost effectiveness when we're seeing the crisis even in our universal services? So, for instance, we've been banging on about this now for 18 months, about the crisis in the maternal child health nurse sector, where we're seeing a 40% increase in the mothers who are coming to us, who are trying to Google about how to feed their babies, what should they be looking for with regard to their developmental milestones. And when you see that in terms of your universal service, you know you've got a really serious problem. We know the evidence in the first 1,000 days specialisation, the evidence is there, and yet we still cannot get traction with this government with regard to making those investments, which is actually cost effective. So you've got a cost-effective, evidence-based approach, and yet we still can't get traction in this area. What would be your advice? What's the strategy going forward to get this so that we don't find ourselves still 12 to 18 months down the track with a workforce that simply cannot meet the demand because of the perfect storm that we now have with regard to the retention, the recruitment, the training of a highly specialised workforce compared to our workforce of family services specialists? Thank you.
Did anyone want to... go first?
Yeah, look, I understand the frustration, because I think ultimately, and this is such, there are so many different services and there are so many different models in terms of what's across the sector, and proving and showing to the Treasury that, look, if you invest here, you save money there, particularly in a system like Australia where it's fragmented and where potentially you're saving money for another section of government, and so suddenly no one really cares because it's not their budget that's saved, and that causes a lot of problems across the health system, across the community sector. I think, and this really is what I think in terms of what would be good in terms of, well, what is the next reform, is that the Treasury makes it much clearer what they want to see, and that they have the capability. We saw gender responsive budgeting this budget, and obviously opening the eyes to the Treasurer and to ministers that policies affect people differently. Now, it seems like such a basic thing, but if the analysis isn't done, then it's very difficult for decision makers to be able to take that into account when they're making decisions. But likewise, when we're talking about, well, what does early investment mean? What do you want to see in terms of what the savings are? I think there is that need for really a capability lift within Treasury about, well, what does early intervention look like? How do we actually do cost effectiveness analysis? How do we judge these policy proposals in a way that's systematic and clear to the sector so that you know what bar you're trying to jump? Because I think at the moment it can be quite difficult to understand that. The issue, I guess, from a government's perspective and for the sector is often, and the nature of these services is they do need to be different across communities. So if we think about Aboriginal controlled organisations, the nature of the way the services are delivered, so there's a lot of variability. It's not a cookie cutter situation, and they need to be able to respond to their community. So we need a framework that allows people to easily provide the information and the evidence base that this is working. And we need a government that's committed to that framework, and a Treasury, I think, ultimately, as an ex-finance officer, that understands the importance of this skill set in their analysis of these policy proposals. Because I think at the moment that's probably the thing that's missing in terms of that capability within government to do this analysis and to understand and therefore trust it.
Can I just add in quickly to that though, for everyone who knows my passion in the early years, previously heading up Early Learning Association Australia, one of the things that strikes me is that when we're advocating for 3-year-old kinder and we were being told that we were dreaming, even though the evidence was there was Nobel Prize winning economists that showed that significant value of the early years. And it was, I think, that cumulative building of evidence over time, but even with that at the time we were still told we were kind of dreaming and annoying and to go away, etc. And now I watch it being rolled out across the state, and I was really excited actually to see in the budget papers yesterday to see there's more money, and there's more money particularly for regions where it's place, you've got your model but you've also got the place-based differences in the way that it plays out. So I think for me it's around that continuing to build the model, because as you say, those first 1,000 days are so critical in a child, in a person's life trajectory. And the evidence is in. For me, it's around how we continue to build it and how we continue to tell it and sell it, because it's just such a no-brainer in terms of how we actually change someone's life, whether it's their social health, economic well-being, that the evidence is in. So I just think it's more, I'm really keen to see how we can push this further, because I think it's understood, it's just within a really, such a competing space, but it's also, it's a good news piece.
Yeah. Is there another question, I believe, on this? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Peter McNamara from Southeast Community Links. I just want to add on to what you said, Emma. Emma, firstly, thank you, Emma, for the team for today and what you do. I've got a frustration about the language that's being used by government when we talk about with the values in this room. I don't see the value of our values. I think the community sector over the last 2 years in particular has done more than most, and while the impact of COVID we've all felt, and more so the Victorians, those impacts have not been felt equally. So when I hear a government talk a language of efficiencies, evidence, values, geez, we're the masters of low cost, no cost. We are. And I don't know what more evidence, so Angela and to David, what more evidence do we need to show to government? I mean, I get it, we're in the business of showing outcomes, but you're squeezing so much out of us. I mean, we're seeing such disadvantage on the ground, not just clients, but our staff. What more do we have to show? So efficiency languages, budget crawlbacks, evidence, it's BS, it is. What we need more of is advocacy, so it's great, and to Emma and the team, we need more advocacy to show that it's important, because if you can't support the most vulnerable, we're stuffed. They can talk about right now it's recovery. That's BS, we're in response still. We are, as much as the media to extents, the politicians want to talk about it, we are truly in response on the ground. So I want to say that to the Treasurer with all respect, but come on, really? Well done, Emma and the team.
Does anyone want to respond?
I was hoping for a question on markets and the care economy. No, Peter, look, of course, look, your comments are well made, and I applaud you for making them and reminding us of that. I think that where it's difficult and tricky, and I think for VCOSS, and I do want to actually back up what you said, I think VCOSS has done a fabulous job over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, but for a long period of time, and I think we're very fortunate to have Emma and Damien. I think you've got a terrific board as well, but we've been well served by that advocacy. Don't forget what I said. You want to see a government that has actually massively increased social spending, you are looking at it. And I know it still seems tough, because it is tough, because there's a lot to be done. So, but I think you can accept your point, but still accept that a heck of a lot has been put into the system over the last 3 years in particular. Like, to an extent I would never have believed possible. Right, that's the scale. It is truly enormous, and that's what I think is setting us up for a challenge for the next term. Where do we go from here? What's the pitch? What's the argument? Where things, and it's like Sarah, I thought your question was really good. The big housing build. We've got to start putting our mind to the next term, because pretty much, if you were thinking, Emma, about all the things you'd like to achieve this term, you got it and more. So what's the next pitch? What's the pitch for the next term? And it can't just be a 1 year thing. I think, Sarah, your point was a longer term. We've got to think of a 4 year pitch. What are we going to try and achieve? But I think for the moment, we can actually be pretty pleased that despite some disappointments, we've achieved far more than we could have thought possible.
I think Ryan.
I'll just
I don't want to cut you
respond, because I do understand, as an economist, obviously I always come to these things with an economic lens, and I sit on the board at Gen Vic, and obviously, you know, I want equity between men and women because it's the right thing, yet I spend my time arguing about it, that it's the best for our economy. Now, I guess my point would be, investing in social services is good for our economy. It invests in our people and it lifts the productive capacity. Now, you can choose to engage in that argument and show your evidence and fight that fight. And I think the reason you do that is because it strengthens your arm and it gets money out of treasuries. And ultimately, should we do it anyway? Because is it the right thing to do to house a homeless person? Of course it is. But it's also economically the right thing to do. To get that homeless person off the street, they stop using health services, they're more likely to work, you address people's mental health, they're more likely to be more productive. It's good for our economy as well. And I think there's no need for the social sector to not engage in that debate, because on the other side, there are other people fighting for these resources and this funding, and they're certainly making those arguments. And often they're not as backed by the evidence as for the social sector. So it's about how you frame it, and I know that sometimes it feels like, particularly for me as a feminist, it feels wrong, because I feel like I'm just saying, oh, we need to lift the productive capacity of our economy, let's go, 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 when really I just want my daughter and son to be equal when they grow up, right? Like, it's not about necessarily just the economy, but when the economic arguments are there, you make them, because you make your strongest case you can.
Thank you. And we'll go down to Ryan. Got a question from online for us.
Yeah, one from the Slido, and it's actually a composite question I might ask from a few of the questions that were submitted for the Treasurer. There are a number of questions that sought to get the Treasurer's response to some specific cuts in certain areas. So some of the homelessness areas, some references to child protection funding going down in net terms, and a few other things, AO and D as well. I guess the economic question is, can you actually cut services as a way of fiscal repair? Is that an economically sound approach? What would be your view on that?
So I think it's difficult, and without going into the specifics, obviously during the pandemic, you know, certain areas got a lot of additional funding, and so you'd expect some normalisation. So is that a cut or is it not? I think, you know, that's a difficult situation. I think in terms of investments in homelessness and, you know, child welfare, you know, they're underfunded areas, right? So even if they did increase during the pandemic, you know, they need to stay at that elevated level, if not increase further, to address those issues. And so are they good economic policy in the long run? We'll know. And I think child protection, you know, in my view, is one of the great areas that needs significant reform and investment and new perspectives in this country. We do this, I think, very poorly, where we only provide services to those at the absolute crisis end, leaving a lot of children incredibly vulnerable, and we know the long-term consequences of that trauma. So, you know, as a general reform area, that's a hugely expensive area, but one that needs more focus. So cutting services is not good from an economic perspective, because obviously it reduces the overall, you know, in the sense of, would an austerity budget have been a better economic budget? No, because that would have cut off economic growth. And we saw that, we talked about the 1990s, we're talking about it a lot at the moment, because interest rates have, it's quite, I mean, it's sort of funny, gone up 0.25%, and we're talking about 17% interest rates. I would say household debt is much higher now, so interest rate increases have a more significant impact. But when can it cut back? That cut off growth in this state, and we saw that the economic recovery from the 1990s recession in Victoria was significantly slower than the rest of the country. So austerity just lowers economic growth, and it basically doesn't pay for itself. So basically, the budget ends up in a worse position than it would have if you had spent the money. So they were right, I think, yesterday to, in a general sense, keep the level of funding, as you said, going. In terms of specific programs, it's, you know, clearly he seemed a bit uncomfortable about the homelessness question, and perhaps, you know, there'll be some revisit on that, one would hope.
Thank you. I think we've got a question down the back. Table 15.
Good morning, Danny Schwartz from Playgroup Victoria. Just building on the first 1,000 days, one of the things I was going to ask the Treasurer didn't have to do with money, which hopefully would have made him a bit happy. Structurally, the government's done amazing things in early childhood, there's no question about it. 3-year-old kinder's fantastic, you know, really significant, and as the Treasurer would say, nation-leading maternal child and health structure in place, which is fantastic. But the gap between maternal child and health and kinder is significant. The ages and stages visits stretch out and the participation drops off. And playgroup is really important, and it uses that universal model, that proportional universal model. Most people want to and can do things for themselves, and where it is that they need more, we give them more. And this government's done well in that area. Where people need more, they've given more. But an unintended consequence at the last election was that funding for Playgroup Victoria, for example, was moved from Department of Education to DHS and now DFFH. And our minister now is Minister Wynne. I'm not sure that he even knows that we're in his portfolio. But to the government's credit, they appointed Ingrid Stitt as Minister for Early Childhood. Brilliant. She will not talk to me because she doesn't give us any money. So my question to the Minister was, in terms of advice, how can we get the government to sort of shift from this silo mentality? This is not about money, this is about structure, so that the 350,000 families that attend playgroup every week, the Minister for Early Childhood is engaged with them in some way. And that was going to be my question. I'm not sure how we're going to tackle that one.
Yeah, is anyone that can give him any advice as to how you get the government's attention?
Look, I think some of it is to the issue about the status order within the budget. So it's interesting because I'm a strong supporter of the care economy as a concept, but it's interesting talking to early childhood educators who go, we don't like to be thought of in that sector because it's too low status. We want to be thought of as education because education is about investment. And I think that means that those of us who think care is actually about investment as much as education, we've got a long way to go still to try and get a reimagining of what that care work is. So it doesn't really matter in a sense whether you're in education or care, you get treated with the respect that you deserve to receive from the work that's done. There's generally a low recognition of the skilled work that's undertaken in the care sector. I think it's not so in education. I think people generally recognise that, the skill that's involved. So I think that's the message for me from that very good question. It's about how do we continue to elevate that understanding of care. You see it at the moment. You know, you look at the debates happening federally with the 25% pay rise going on and the claim in the Fair Work Commission at the moment for aged care workers. And everybody's saying it's skilled work, right? It is incredibly skilled work. It's just not recognised as skilled work. So we think anybody can do that. We'll pay them tuppence halfpenny. And if they won't do it, we'll just get migrants in. There's a job for us to do over the next 4 or 5 years to lift an understanding of the complexity and skill involved in the work that we all do. That would be my answer back to you.
The other thing I'd add, Danny, is I reckon, and I know we've had this conversation before and we've posed it to different ministers at different forums, we see this issue across different areas. So even to draw a different example, across energy, and so we've got Minister D'Ambrosio, who's doing a great job in the energy portfolio, but yeah, we've got concessions that sit over in DFFH, and we've seen at times that rub, where we've often been in conversations with Treasury around what are you going to do around the utility relief grant? And they look at us like, no one's raised that because it's not necessarily at the top of the list for DFFH Minister, even though it might be for Minister D'Ambrosio. So I think for me, there's almost that part, and I'm interested in the narrative piece going forward and how we start to work through what are silos within government. So for each minister, what's their top things that they're pitching into that ERC process? So what gets up and what doesn't, and then what is forgotten, as you say. And I think for me, I feel so passionately around playgroups being seen as part of that broader early childhood piece because it is. So I think we've just got to keep working on that and work at how we get cut through.
We'll go to table 15, I believe now, if we can. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Tiffany from the VCOSS. As a young person, quoting the Treasurer, I'm very interested in the education section of this budget. So we as an organisation are very happy to see the investments being put into schools and especially specialist schools and reducing the teaching hours for teachers. But most of these investments and initiatives seem to be aimed at benefiting future students. So as an organisation, we've declared a mental health crisis for students due to the remote learning that we've been enduring for the past 2 years. So I guess my question to the Treasurer, or now to you, was how can the government and what can the government do to improve or help the well-being and mental health of students now, like me?
I just feel this really personally, actually, in terms of having kids. Like my eldest daughter did year 11 and 12. She's just in first year uni this year, and my youngest is in year 10. So in terms of thinking around the mental health impacts, and just to draw a personal story, I ran into a mum that I hadn't seen for ages. Our kids played netball together on the weekend. She saw me at the shops and asked her how her daughter was going, and she started crying. Her daughter she's a superstar on the netball court. She's just a really great kid, and she's now not able to get out of bed and go to school. So I just think there's a part around what is, as you say, for students right now. So I don't have the answer to your question. I wish I did. I think it's something I feel very motivated in terms of how do we get that. But the reality of kids being isolated at home in their bedrooms, and we know for people whether they be in overcrowded houses or whatever their circumstances were, it's really, really hard, and we owe it to our young people about what do we do now. And one of the things we're arguing around is a youth guarantee in terms of making sure that for every young person within 3 months of them leaving school, that they're signed up, if in effect across community, for wherever you go, you're guaranteed either a place in education, in skills or in work, because we think that there's a generation of people who've missed out. So that's one of the things that VCOSS is advocating for, is a youth guarantee on that front. But I think your point also goes more broadly, and that is around the services, if you like, or the support that has to be there to actually support our young people and say that they matter. Because, you know, for me, having kids that just can't get out of bed anymore and can't function, that's, again, are we only going to deal with them when they're at the crisis end of our system, or are we going to try and help them now? So sorry, that's a really personal response to your question, but I feel it very keenly.
And look, I think, again, and we talked about missed opportunities, and perhaps this is another space where we know coming out of the pandemic, and again, you know, with young kids who are probably suffering high levels of anxiety certainly than they had going into the pandemic, and you can see it more broadly that mental health for our young people is a huge issue. I think what we learnt when we closed schools was how important they are to our community, I think, and while more teachers is good, it's really those other support services that are the lack of those other support services within our schools that are taking teachers away from teaching, because they are having to deal with these other issues that their children in their class are dealing with. And so it would have been good, I think, in this budget, as well as seeing additional teachers, to see more of that support staff at schools, and at public schools in particular, because private schools, you know, better resource generally have it, so that we can see schools more as that central place within the community, and that for young people, those support services and those wraparound services. And I think this is a reform agenda that, you know, where we need to be investing going forward. And again, based on the evidence, that providing that support within schools is really important, but it's not just about teaching. Schools just are not an education. They are, you know, they are much, much more than that for our children. And I think the pandemic, you know, showed us that in spades.
Does anyone else have any questions from the floor? Yes, go ahead.
Thanks very much to VCOSS for putting this on. So a question to the panel. I'm Josh Lorenz from Catholic Social Services Victoria. We recently released some research that's sort of tracking the pandemic over the last 18 months. And we've still seen sort of there's a tripling in job active. The Treasurer gave a very rosy picture of how the Victorian economy is bouncing back. And I guess within this, my question is, how do we maintain a focus on those people who are sort of being left out and left behind, which I think Peter made the point, we're absolutely in response mode. We have triple the number of job active caseloads in Victoria, triple the people on job seeker. So that's sort of, how do we keep that? Don't want it to be negative, but it's really, you know, triple the amount of people we're seeing. Another part of the research was that within the changing cohort that social services across Victoria are seeing, so we're seeing the people who are in that crisis end that so many of our services have to focus on. But I guess this new emerging group of people who are caught in that tripling number of insecure work or who have casual jobs, and we're having to support them as well. How do we keep those things front and centre in mind in terms of, we have JVS, I think that's a really good program. We've got some positives, the Job Advocate program that was launched, in the last couple of years. But how do we keep pressure on with these kind of things going forward, even as crisis response, etc., continue to occupy so much of our workforce minds?
Can I jump in first? I'll just answer with some work that I think complements the work that you've been doing, Josh, which is a brilliant piece, by the way. I just wanted to speak, for those of you who don't know, VCOSS is running a listening tour. We're calling it Voices of Victoria around the state. We're working in conjunction with Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, and we've gone, the risk of alliteration, Mawal to Maui kind of thing, sorry, to Mildura, I should say, across the state to listen to local communities about how are you going. And one of the things that strikes me is that irrespective of where we go, the key themes remain the same. So while they differ in place, so things like the digital divide, things like food relief, and going to Peter's point earlier, nearly every neighbourhood house, and a number of them were not engaged in food relief before the pandemic. They've got signs around food relief and people are coming in because they need food. It's pretty basic. So we're watching community, and we're getting a mix of people. So you're getting a mix of people who are in crisis. I'm thinking, one day I was in literally the tin shed in St Albans, which is their neighbourhood house, and the people in that community were doing it really, really hard. But I just think the themes around, some broader themes around things like loneliness were really, it comes up irrespective of where we go. Food relief, cost of housing, cost of fuel, issues around the internet divide, the cost of devices, being able to have access in the first place. Good luck with showing a certificate if you don't have a smartphone, and plenty of people have been caught without one. Loneliness has been a significant one, irrespective of what people's background, etc. is. So we're collecting those themes. We're doing some online themes, online sessions, particularly for people with disability today, I think, and we did another one yesterday. Because one of the things we've found is that women's voices have come through very strongly. So I've forgotten the name. One of the team would remind me. There's a group of the men's group. I'm looking at Livy. She knows the name. It's Old Men, New Ideas. We're working with them. But anyway, the point is what we're doing is collecting the work, listening intentionally to communities so that we can frame that up in a report that helps actually shape the narrative around this is what people want to see. So in our advocacy around a wellbeing agenda, we're saying one of the things that keeps coming up is a disconnect between people and government. So we want to bridge that disconnect, and obviously we'd bridge that disconnect in working with all of you as our members, and a number of you have been undertaking reports, etc. as well. We want to bring them together. So it's a really compelling case to government around this is what people care about and think, and that, to try and bridge that disconnect. But for us, it's about that broader wellbeing agenda. So I just wanted to talk about that because that's really key work that VCOSS has underway.
Yeah. I'll just say I think it is a really important issue to raise and to have more data, and I say this again as an economist, but more understanding of, because I'm certainly, when I'm looking at the data at the moment, and we saw the employment figures, what I'm seeing is actually the whole growth has been people who weren't born in Australia. And the premise probably is that they're people whose visa status has changed during the pandemic. So actually we haven't seen new people into work. And what that means is for those that were already disadvantaged, they haven't necessarily got a job, they're facing rising cost of living pressures, rising rental pressures, they've had the impact of the mental health issues from the pandemic. So actually, and going to your point, the disadvantage has intensified for that group. So they haven't necessarily benefited from the economic recovery. Now, the problem is getting that through and trying to get that story through the overall picture, which is unemployment's at 4%, everyone's great, let's go party, when actually, and going to your point, I think the real story probably is that actually a lot of people aren't doing that well and haven't benefited from this economic recovery and are actually doing a lot tougher. I think it's about being mindful of that data and getting that evidence out there and really getting that narrative of, look, this is the evidence here. And we can see it in the job seeker numbers. The rates simply haven't come down to the extent that you would expect if unemployment really is at 4%. And so it's a really, from an economist's point of view, the data is really complicated at the moment because we're dealing with really high level data. And it's not necessarily getting to that granular level about, how have people actually tracked across time.
Anyway.
Just as my take on that very good question is that I think the sector's in a remarkably strong position to get that really excellent research, get it into VCOSS, which has become very effective at packaging up as an appealing proposition to governments to fund. And so I think that the system's working pretty well. And that's how I'd see it would be a great way for us moving forward to find ways of keeping that, it's almost like advanced research coming forward to then work on a budget pitch to address it, because you're at the advanced stage of understanding something. And I think that's tremendous. I think that's really a strong mark of improvement for the way the sector operates. It's interesting that VCOSS is now in such a strong position, the Treasurer comes to an annual breakfast. Think about that as a change. Who would have thought that was possible? So we're in a good position to do it. That sounds like terrific research, by the way.
We'll take one last question from online from Ryan.
Thank you, Sharnelle. And yes, the honour of the last question of the morning goes to Anonymous. And it's a question tailor-made for economists, really. This person asks, are we ever going to see stamp duty reform and a shift to fairer and more predictable land taxes, for instance? If not now, then when?
Look, I'll kick that off. I tried to persuade the Treasurer to look at this 8 years ago and I wasn't successful, and I'm not sure I ever will be. I think the problem is with stamp duties is that it's really great when the market kicks in. Like over the last 12 months, but the reason why the budget's looking as good as it is now is because of the property market. It took off. I mean, what's going to happen over the next 12 months? It goes into reverse. So prices are tipped in the budget to fall by 4%, turnover's tipped to fall, so they're going to lose $2 billion. But it's very difficult to find an alternative to that tax that works. The ACT has tried, New South Wales has tried, and they haven't succeeded yet. Without the Commonwealth helping towards that very big shift, it's going to take a while for that to happen. But I think, does there need to be reform? Yes, there does need to be reform. Just one final thing from me. One thing that we forget about, this government has been extremely good at being prepared to introduce new taxes. So the mental health levy was a remarkable thing for a state government to do. Nobody does that. They did. And they put all that money that's coming in towards mental health reform, that's locked in now. That's not going to be taken away. But I think that the sort of land tax, stamp duty tax thing is something, hopefully with a change of federal government, it may be possible to come back and look at to make the state's tax base much better and much fairer. Because at the moment, state's tax base is incredibly regressive and it's still far too volatile.
Yeah, I accord with that. I think unless it's part of a national housing policy or strategy, which clearly we desperately need in this country, that looks at the whole tax system for housing and also looks at the funding of housing and how we see housing not as a wealth generator but actually as providing people a place to live, then we won't get that reform. I think in New South Wales it's simply too expensive in the short term for the state governments to fiscally carry without support from the federal government. So unless it's a national reform agenda, Anonymous, it won't happen. So I think for me it would be, hopefully a new Labor government does a national housing strategy that really looks at, unlike the parliamentary inquiry report, which was a travesty of evidence, actually looks at solving this problem. I don't think it will happen, but hopefully as part of that it will, because it is just so much more efficient. Like, it's so frustrating that we have this tax system and this tax base that's just so incredibly inefficient and just adds to that inefficiency in housing, which adds to the inaffordability of housing. So anyway, fingers crossed.
Emma, I might just ask if you can to outline how we can stay across the VCOSS budget response.
Oh, absolutely, thank you. So we'll be finishing our sort of key analyses by 5 o'clock on Friday. We're posting our updates online. So we've done sort of the headline updates now, but we do a deeper dive into each of those areas. So keep an eye on our website and on our, I think you can see up there on the Big Budget 22, that will be keeping you informed. So we do that deeper dive into each area, partly for a few reasons. One is sometimes there's some smaller, really great announcements that you don't spot. They're not the big ticket items on budget day, as well as some of the areas where there's perhaps some cuts and things taken away that aren't easy to spot in the first instance, things like so-called lapsing programs and those sorts of things. So the VCOSS fabulous team is at work pulling that together at breakneck speed. So we'll have it up there, and please do keep an eye on it. And our goal is to have the full analysis up by the end of the day on Friday.
Emma, where do we get the number plates?
Do you know, we had, I'll let Ryan tell the story later, we had trouble getting anyone to print them, so we were printing dodgy number plates. So, that's a whole other story that I can go into.
I went through 3 number plate manufacturers, novelty number plates, and said, can you make this number plate for me? And they all thought I wanted to rob a bank or something. I'm like, no, we're going to give it to the treasurer. Like, I think it's sweet. And I just sounded even more dodgy. So we found a way.
That's right. We give a round of applause to our panellists. Thank you so much.
If I can say a quick thank you to everyone, if that is all right.
Of course, this
Sharnelle.
is VCOSS.
So if I can, sincerely in thanking the panellists, so Angela and David, we are so grateful. Actually, we've got something else to go with that as well. We are so grateful to you both for making the time available to be here today. That economic insight and analysis is so critical, and I think also providing some different perspectives for us to think through as well. Good dear friends of VCOSS, David also does a pre-budget training with our members, etc. We are very lucky, so we're very grateful to you. So please join with me in thanking David and Angela. And Sharnelle, we are in awe of the incredible work that you do, and we are very fortunate as a state to have a Victorian political reporter of your calibre who asks those sharp and incisive questions, and also with the good humour with which you do. I think we all stood in awe of your Twitter account during the pandemic, and you also brought us great joy in amongst everything else that was happening, let alone, like, I feel like I know your dogs.
You do,
like,
yeah. People know my health issues from Twitter. I was all out there. It was a real time, but thank you very much.
And your generosity in being here today, honestly, we are so appreciative, and would please accept our very sincere thank you. And please join with me in thanking Sharnelle. Thank you.
That concludes, it's awkward doing this, it's like I'm holding a child, but it's thank you so much for attending today. VCOSS is very, very grateful, and we hope that you've taken something away from this morning's breakfast, and of course, I'm no doubt you'll be going through budget books like myself for the rest of the day. So enjoy doing that, and thank you for being here today.